For every American heavy bomber that flew over occupied Europe in the fall of 1943, the statistical probability of completing its required 25-mission tour stood at approximately 25%. For the 10 men aboard each B-17 Flying Fortress, the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, and 6 gunners, this wasn't abstract mathematics. It was a death sentence delivered in percentages. During what would become known in 8th Air Force records as Black Week, October 8th to 14th, 1943, 140 B-17s failed to return to their English bases. That represented 1,400 airmen, killed, wounded, or destined to spend the remainder of the war in German prisoner of war camps. The loss rate approached 13% per mission. At this rate of attrition, military statisticians calculated the entire American heavy bomber force in Europe would cease to exist by spring 1944. The problem wasn't the aircraft. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress represented cutting-edge aviation technology, a 4-engine behemoth armed with 13.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, strategically positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Boeing's engineers had created what air crews called a flying porcupine, designed to shoot its way unescorted to targets deep in Germany and back. The problem was that the porcupine's quills weren't hitting anything. 8th Air Force intelligence officers working in Nissen huts scattered across East Anglian air bases pored over gun camera footage and after-action reports. The data painted an increasingly desperate picture. American bomber gunners were hitting attacking German fighters with fewer than 2% of the rounds they fired. For every 100 .50 caliber bullets sent streaking toward Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, 98 vanished harmlessly into European skies. German fighter pilots, the battle-hardened veterans of the Luftwaffe, had not only identified the weaknesses in the B-17's defensive scheme, they had perfected tactics to exploit them. They attacked from 12 o'clock high, where the bomber's nose guns had limited traverse. They screamed up from 6 o'clock low, where the ball turret gunner couldn't depress his weapon sufficiently. Most devastatingly, they had mastered the head-on attack, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour, firing their 20mm cannons and 30mm rockets in a deadly pass, then breaking away before bomber gunners could bring their weapons to bear. The United States Army Air Forces responded with textbook solutions. They experimented with formations, tight combat boxes that concentrated defensive fire but made bombers easier targets for flak, loose formations that allowed more maneuverability but created gaps German fighters exploited. They modified B-17s, adding chin turrets to cover the vulnerable frontal approach. They conducted endless training on deflection shooting, the complex art of leading a moving target, aiming not where an enemy aircraft was, but where it would be when bullets arrived. But deflection shooting, while theoretically sound, proved nearly impossible under combat conditions. Consider the mathematics. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 attacking at 300 miles per hour covers 440 feet per second. A .50 caliber bullet travels at 2,900 feet per second. At 600 yards, or 1,800 feet, the bullet takes 0.62 seconds to reach its target. In that time, the fighter moves 273 feet, approximately 20 aircraft lengths. A gunner had to calculate this lead while shivering in -40 degrees Fahrenheit, while his bomber bounced through turbulence, while possibly fighting anoxia from damaged oxygen lines, while cannon shells and 20mm explosions tore through the thin aluminum skin around him, while his friends died beside him. The consensus among gunnery experts, officers who had trained at the Air Corps' prestigious gunnery schools, but who had rarely, if ever, experienced actual air combat, remained unwavering. Bomber gunners must engage at the regulation range of 400 to 600 yards using approved deflection techniques. Follow the training, trust the doctrine. The problem was that the doctrine was getting men killed at an unsustainable rate. During the final 6 months of 1943, the 8th Air Force lost over 600 heavy bombers to German fighters alone.
Each lost B-17 represented 10 men, 6,000 airmen who had followed the rules directly into captivity, injury, or death. The statistics screamed that something fundamental was wrong, but military institutions, particularly those engaged in total war, resist change with impressive inertia. The Army Air Forces had invested millions of dollars and countless training hours preparing 214,000 aerial gunners in the correct technique. Gunnery instructors who had never fired a shot in anger wrote the manuals and ran the schools. They understood ballistics, mathematics, and theory. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand from their classrooms and training ranges, was that their theory had become battlefield fiction. It would require a particular kind of mind to recognize this discrepancy, not the mind of a trained expert, but that of an outsider. It would take a skinny kid from Massachusetts with a high school dropout's healthy skepticism toward authority, a mechanic's understanding of how things actually worked, and an immigrant's understanding that sometimes survival required rewriting the rules. His name was Michael Lewis Aruṭ, and he was about to change everything. Chapter 1: The Making of an Outsider. Springfield, Massachusetts, in the 1920s and 1930s was a city of immigrants, factories, and the hard-scrabble reality of working-class America. The Aruṭ family, Father Salam, Mother Dora, and their children were part of the Lebanese diaspora community that had settled in the city's south end. Salam worked long hours in a textile mill. Dora took in laundry to supplement the family's income. They were, like thousands of other immigrant families during the Great Depression, perpetually close to the edge, but determined to push forward. Michael Lewis Aruṭ, born July 31, 1919, grew up in this environment of making do. Springfield Technical High School provided education, but formal learning never captured young Michael's imagination. What fascinated him were machines, patterns, and solving practical problems. He possessed what later generations would call mechanical intelligence, an intuitive understanding of how systems worked, and more importantly, how they could be made to work better. After 3 years, Aruṭ left school to contribute to the family finances. He found work as a semi-skilled chauffeur and mechanic, jobs that suited his temperament and talents. He wasn't particularly good with books or authority figures, but he excelled at observation and improvisation. In the garages and workshops of Springfield, Aruṭ learned a fundamental truth that would later define his military service. Sometimes the people who design systems aren't the people who have to operate them under real-world conditions. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Aruṭ was 22 years old, single, underemployed, and precisely the demographic the expanding American military needed. On August 25, 1942, Aruṭ walked into the Army recruiting station in Springfield. The recruiter who processed his paperwork saw what was superficially evident, a slender, 130-pound young man who might struggle with the physical demands of infantry service. Aruṭ himself viewed the military as he viewed most opportunities, as practical employment that would provide regular meals and steady pay.
What mattered more than the precise number was the paradigm shift Aruṭ had helped initiate. By the time he rotated home, the 8th Air Force's approach to bomber defense had fundamentally changed. The new doctrine emphasized aggression, early engagement, and psychological disruption alongside marksmanship. Chapter 8: The Statistical Vindication. Post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and the Army Air Force's Statistical Control Division provided rigorous validation of Aruṭ's approach. Researchers compared loss rates between bomber groups that adopted aggressive early engagement and those that adhered longer to traditional doctrine. The difference was statistically significant and operationally meaningful. Formations employing what researchers termed area suppression fire or psychological disruption tactics experienced fighter attack loss rates approximately 25% lower than comparable formations. This translated to hundreds of bombers and thousands of airmen over the course of the bombing campaign.
The analysis revealed several key insights. The disruption effect. Even inaccurate fire at extended range disrupted German attack patterns, reducing the precision and determination of fighter passes. The ammunition trade-off. While gunners using Aruṭ's techniques fired more rounds per engagement, the reduction in bomber losses represented an excellent return on investment. A lost B-17 represented not just the aircraft's cost, $250,000 to $300,000, but the loss of 10 trained crew members and their future combat potential. The training implication. Teaching gunners to employ area suppression required less technical expertise than perfect deflection shooting. This was crucial as the 8th Air Force expanded rapidly, with gunners receiving increasingly abbreviated training. The escort synergy. As long-range fighter escorts, like the P-51 Mustang, became available in early 1944, aggressive bomber defense complemented escort tactics. Disrupted, hesitant fighter attacks made easier targets for American fighters. Perhaps the most telling post-war commentary came from German sources. Luftwaffe after-action reports from late 1943 and early 1944 noted the changing nature of American bomber defense. Oberlieutenant Hans Berger of Jagdgeschwader 26 wrote in his diary, "The American gunners have become more dangerous. They open fire earlier now, before we are in proper position. It requires nerves of steel to press home an attack through this wall of tracers. Many of our newer pilots are breaking off too early." Another German fighter pilot interviewed after the war remarked, "In 1942 and early 1943, we could approach the bombers with confidence. We knew when they would fire. By late 1943, every approach became a gamble. The sky was full of tracers from much farther out. It changed the psychology completely." Chapter 9. The Unlikely Legacy. Michael Aruṭ returned to Springfield, Massachusetts in 1944. He married, raised a family, and resumed the quiet, anonymous life he had left behind. Unlike many war heroes, he never sought publicity. He gave no interviews. He attended no reunions. When the Army offered to publicize his record, he declined. His medals, the Distinguished Service Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart, remained in a drawer, physical reminders of a chapter of his life he preferred not to revisit. In 1958, he received one of the few public honors he accepted, selection as an honorary pallbearer for the ceremony establishing the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. The invitation recognized his status as America's highest-scoring aerial gunner. He attended not for personal recognition, but because it honored all who had served. Aruṭ died in February 1990 at age 70. His obituary in the Springfield Republican noted his service and decorations, but provided little detail about his accomplishments. A few surviving veterans attended his funeral. Massachusetts Representative Richard Neal entered a tribute into the congressional record, calling Aruṭ one of the forgotten heroes of the Second World War. Yet Aruṭ's legacy extended far beyond his personal anonymity. The principle he demonstrated, that aggressive early engagement could disrupt enemy effectiveness independent of hit probability, became embedded in American military doctrine. When the B-29 Superfortress entered service in the Pacific Theater, its gunners were trained in tactics that directly reflected lessons from the European Air War, including early engagement principles. During the Cold War, the concept evolved into what strategists called area denial, or suppression of enemy air defenses. The idea that defensive systems should engage threats at maximum range, forcing attackers to react rather than execute planned attacks, became standard in air defense artillery, naval combat systems, and eventually missile defense. Modern integrated air defense systems, from the Aegis combat system on naval vessels to Patriot missile batteries, embody the same core principle Aruṭ discovered through trial and error. Engage early, engage aggressively, force the enemy to respond to you rather than execute their plan. Chapter 10. The Broader Lessons. The story of Aruṭ offers insights that transcend World War II aerial combat. It speaks to enduring truths about innovation, expertise, and institutional learning. 1. The value of the outsider perspective. Aruṭ succeeded where experts failed precisely because he wasn't an expert. He approached the problem without preconceptions, without investment in existing solutions. His high school dropout status, far from being a liability, gave him the freedom to question what trained experts took for granted. Sometimes the people closest to a problem, the operators, the technicians, the frontline workers, see solutions that specialists miss because they understand the reality of the system, not just its theory. 2. The importance of empirical observation. Aruṭ's method emerged from observing what actually happened in combat, not what should happen according to doctrine. He trusted his eyes over the manual. In an age increasingly dependent on data and simulation, his story reminds us that reality often diverges from models, and that direct observation remains invaluable. 3. The role of courage in innovation. Innovating under fire, literally, requires a different kind of courage. Aruṭ didn't just propose a new theory, he tested it in conditions where failure meant death. Then he persisted despite institutional resistance, professional skepticism, and the very real possibility of disciplinary action. Innovation often requires the courage to challenge orthodoxy. 4. The psychology of combat. Aruṭ understood intuitively what military psychologists would later document systematically. Combat effectiveness depends on psychology as much as technology. By disrupting the German pilots' focus and confidence, he reduced their effectiveness even without hits. This recognition that human factors, fear, concentration, confidence, are critical combat multipliers remains relevant in everything from cyber war to counterinsurgency. 5. Institutional adaptability. The 8th Air Force's eventual acceptance of Aruṭ's methods demonstrates that even large bureaucratic institutions can adapt under pressure. The key was leadership willing to consider evidence over tradition, and operational commanders who advocated for solutions that worked rather than solutions that fit established paradigms. Epilogue: the mathematics of survival. Returning to where we began, the mathematics. In late 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate that threatened the entire daylight strategic bombing campaign. By early 1944, loss rates to fighter attacks had declined significantly. Multiple factors contributed: long-range escorts, improved tactics, German pilot shortages, but improved defensive gunnery played a measurable role. Conservative estimates suggest that improved gunnery tactics, pioneered by Aruṭ and adopted throughout the 8th Air Force, reduced losses by at least 1% per mission. Over 6 months of intensive operations, this translated to approximately 75 bombers and 750 men who returned home who otherwise would not have. These weren't abstract numbers. They were fathers, brothers, sons. They were men who would have families, build careers, contribute to their communities. They were lives saved because a skinny kid from Springfield looked at the rules, saw they weren't working, and decided to write new ones. Michael Aruṭ never saw himself as a hero. He was, in his own estimation, just doing his job. But sometimes doing one's job exceptionally well, with observation, courage, and a willingness to challenge convention, changes the course of events in ways that resonate far beyond the immediate moment. His story.
Neither could have predicted that this unremarkable enlistment would lead to one of the most remarkable combat records in American military history. Chapter 2. Learning the Rules and Doubting Them. The United States Army Air Forces in 1942 operated the largest and most systematic aerial gunnery training program in history. As the 8th Air Force prepared for the daylight strategic bombing campaign over Europe, it recognized that its success and survival depended on the effectiveness of its bomber defenses. The solution was standardization. Every aerial gunner would receive identical training based on the latest theories of air combat. Aruṭ progressed through the pipeline. Basic training at Greensboro, North Carolina. Gunnery school at Fort Myers, Florida. The curriculum was intensive and technically demanding. Instructors taught recruits to strip and reassemble the .50 caliber Browning machine gun blindfolded. They drilled them on clearing jams while wearing heavy flight gloves at simulated altitude. They immersed them in the mathematics of deflection shooting, using elaborate mechanical trainers that simulated attacking aircraft. The central principle of 8th Air Force gunnery doctrine was engagement range. Gunners were taught to hold fire until enemy fighters closed to between 400 and 600 yards. The reasoning was ballistically sound. At shorter ranges, the probability of hitting a fast-moving target increased dramatically. Firing at longer ranges wasted ammunition, increased barrel wear, and gave away a bomber's defensive capabilities without achieving results. Aruṭ absorbed the training, but something about it nagged at him. The methodology felt abstract, divorced from the chaotic reality he imagined combat would entail. The instructors spoke with absolute certainty, but they spoke from classrooms, not from the freezing, vibrating tail positions of B-17s under attack. Still, he kept his doubts to himself, completed his training, and in June 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael Aruṭ found himself assigned to the 527th Bombardment Squadron, 379th Bombardment Group, based at RAF Kimballton in Cambridgeshire, England. His position? Tail gunner on B-17 F-75-BO, serial number 42-29896, nicknamed Tondaleo after the seductive South Pacific character in the 1942 film White Cargo. The tail gunner's position on a B-17 was arguably the most psychologically demanding assignment in the aircraft. Isolated in a plexiglass bubble extending from the bomber's rear, separated from the rest of the crew by the entire length of the fuselage, the tail gunner faced backward as Europe receded beneath him. When German fighters attacked from the rear, their preferred approach for singling out stragglers, the tail gunner was the bomber's last line of defense. He was also, statistically, the most likely to die. Of all positions on the B-17, only the ball turret gunner faced higher casualty rates. On his initial combat missions in June and early July 1943, Aruṭ performed as trained. He waited for German fighters to enter the prescribed engagement envelope. He calculated deflection. He fired controlled bursts. He watched his tracers arc through the sky and disappear behind the rapidly maneuvering fighters. He watched other B-17s in his formation take hits, catch fire, shed pieces, and spiral toward the earth. He listened over the intercom as crews reported casualties, sometimes ending with the chilling, "Sorry boys, we've had it," before a bomber disappeared in an explosion or broke apart. And through it all, Aruṭ's practical, problem-solving mind worked. The disconnect between what he had been taught and what he observed grew impossible to ignore. The doctrine assumed a rational, almost mathematical duel. Fighter approaches, gunner calculates, gunner fires, fighter is hit or breaks off. Reality was chaos, a screaming, vibrating, freezing nightmare of noise, fear, and imminent death. The moment of clarity came not during combat, but during the interminable hours between missions when air crews attempted to distract themselves from the statistical certainty that their luck would eventually run out. Aruṭ was performing maintenance on his twin .50 caliber Brownings, running cleaning patches through the barrels when the realization crystallized. What if the entire premise was wrong?
Chapter 3. Flipping the Equation. Aruṭ's reasoning was deceptively simple, the kind of practical insight that often eludes experts precisely because they're too invested in their expertise. The training manual specified engaging at 400 to 600 yards because that range offered the optimal balance between bullet velocity, dispersion, and target size. But Aruṭ observed something the manual writers, safely ensconced in their stateside classrooms, apparently overlooked. By the time a German fighter reached 600 yards, it was already well within its own effective firing range. The German Messerschmitt Bf-190 and Focke-Wulf FW-190A fighters that attacked American bomber formations were armed with a mix of machine guns and cannons. The 20mm MG-151-20 cannon had an effective range of approximately 600 yards. More ominously, some German fighters carried Werfer Granate 21 rocket launchers, unguided rockets with an effective range exceeding 800 yards. This meant German pilots could open fire before American gunners were even authorized to respond. The tactical implication was profound. By adhering to Doctrine, American gunners were ceding the initiative to their attackers. German pilots could approach, stabilize their aircraft, aim, and fire, all before facing defensive fire. The bomber absorbed damage before its gunners engaged. Aruṭ's insight was to invert this dynamic. What if gunners fired first, much earlier than Doctrine allowed, before German pilots expected return fire? What if they forced the attackers to react rather than execute? The objections were obvious and rooted in conventional wisdom. Firing at ranges beyond 600 yards was ballistically inefficient. Hit probability at 900 yards was negligible. Early firing would waste precious ammunition, increased barrel wear, and give away a bomber's defensive capabilities without achieving results. But Aruṭ, the high school dropout from Springfield, understood something the experts missed. Combat isn't governed solely by ballistics. Psychology matters. Rhythm and predictability matter. The confidence of an attacker matters. His hypothesis was straightforward. Even inaccurate fire at extended range would disrupt German attack patterns. A fighter pilot lining up for a killing pass operates in a state of intense focus. He must stabilize his aircraft, manage his speed, line up his sights, and hold steady for the critical seconds of his firing pass. Introducing unexpected defensive fire, even fire unlikely to score hits, forces him to break that focus. He flinches, he jinks, he breaks off and must restart his attack sequence, losing precious seconds, altitude, and position. Aruṭ wasn't proposing that gunners could consistently shoot down fighters at 900 yards. He was proposing that they could deny German pilots the stable, predictable environment they needed to execute accurate attacks.
On July 30, 1943, during a mission to Kassel, Germany, Aruṭ decided to test his theory in combat. Chapter 4. The Kassel Mission. The mission brief for July 30 targeted the Fießler aircraft factory in Kassel, a vital component of Germany's fighter production. Intelligence estimated strong fighter opposition. For the man of the 379th Bomb Group, this meant another day of calculating odds, checking equipment, and trying to ignore the cold knot of fear that settled in the stomach before every mission. As Tondeleau joined the formation over the North Sea, Aruṭ settled into his tail position. He wore electrically heated suit, leather flight jacket, parachute harness, flak vest, and oxygen mask. Over 50 pounds of equipment in a space barely larger than a telephone booth. Outside his plexiglass bubble, the temperature would plummet to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude. The formation crossed the Dutch coast. Almost immediately, the first flak bursts appeared, black puffs of smoke with bright orange cores that jolted the bomber as concussive waves hit. Then came the fighters.
German ground controllers had vectored Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s onto the American formation. They began their attacks with disciplined efficiency, making slashing passes from various directions. Over the intercom, gunners called out positions: fighters 3 o'clock high, bandits 6 o'clock level. Aruṭ watched as a schwarm, or flight, of 4 Bf-109s formed up behind the bomber stream, preparing for a classic rear attack. According to Doctrine, he should wait until they closed to 600 yards. He didn't. At approximately 900 yards, a distance where the fighters were barely discernible as crosses rather than specks, Aruṭ opened fire. Long bursts from his twin .50 caliber Brownings sent streams of tracer rounds arcing toward the approaching Germans. The bright orange tracers, one every 5th round, created visible lines through the sky. Over the intercom, someone muttered, "Aruṭ's wasting ammo again." But then something remarkable happened. The German formation, flying in the tight discipline for which the Luftwaffe was famous, abruptly scattered. The fighters broke formation, jinking violently to avoid the unexpected fire. Their smooth, coordinated approach disintegrated into individual defensive maneuvers. One Messerschmitt, perhaps piloted by a less experienced flyer, held its course too long. Aruṭ's tracers converged on it. A flicker of flame appeared at the wing root, then spread. The Bf-109 rolled onto its back and spiraled downward, trailing smoke. The psychological effect was immediate. The remaining German fighters, now wary of the unexpectedly aggressive defense, made their subsequent attacks with less precision, breaking off sooner, firing from less optimal angles. But the Germans were professionals. They adapted. A second wave attacked, this time pressing closer despite Aruṭ's early fire. At 600 yards, one of the Bf-109s opened up with its 20mm cannons. Shells slammed into Tondeleo's tail section. One shattered the oxygen line feeding Aruṭ's position. Another jammed his right-hand gun. A third shell fragment tore through his shoulder. The sudden decompression and loss of oxygen created immediate anoxia. Aruṭ's vision tunneled. His thoughts grew sluggish. The excruciating cold became a distant sensation. Through sheer force of will, he maintained consciousness. With numbed fingers, he cleared the jam in his right gun, a complex procedure involving pulling the charging handle, removing the bolt, extracting the stuck cartridge, and reassembling, all while wounded, oxygen-starved, and under continuous attack. Resuming fire with both guns, Aruṭ engaged another Bf-109 that had closed to point-blank range. His sustained fire walked across the fighter's engine and cockpit. The Messerschmitt's nose dropped, and it fell away, obviously out of control. The battle continued for what seemed like hours, but was actually minutes. When the German fighters finally broke off, Tondeleo's tail section resembled Swiss cheese. 4 Bf-109s had been destroyed, 3 confirmed by other crew members, and a 4th listed as probable. But the cost was high. Aruṭ was bleeding profusely from his shoulder wound. Oxygen deprivation had left him weak and disoriented. Only the bomber's descent to lower altitude as it returned over the North Sea prevented him from losing consciousness entirely. When Tondileo touched down at RAF Kimbolton, ground crews stared in disbelief at the damage. The tail gun position was virtually destroyed. Aruṭ had to be helped from the aircraft. He collapsed on the hardstand and was rushed to the base hospital, where surgeons removed shell fragments from his shoulder and treated him for hypoxia and exposure. As he lay recovering, the implications of what had happened over Kassel were beginning to ripple through the 8th Air Force. Chapter 5: The Doctrine War. In the hierarchical world of the United States Air Forces, combat results flowed through specific channels. Intelligence officers debriefed returning crews, compiling reports that worked their way up the chain of command. Aruṭ's claim of 4 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single mission, an extraordinary tally for any gunner, immediately attracted attention and skepticism. At the headquarters of the 1st Bombardment Division, intelligence officers reviewed the claims. 4 kills? By a tail gunner? In one mission? The skepticism was palpable. Fighter pilots occasionally achieved such scores in their agile P-47s and P-51s, but bomber gunners didn't become aces. The very concept seemed contradictory. Bombers were targets. Their guns were defensive weapons. Gunners might occasionally damage or deter fighters, but systematically destroying them? The existing doctrine said it wasn't possible. But the evidence accumulated. Lieutenant Robert Bob Brink, Tondaleo's pilot, confirmed seeing 2 fighters explode. The navigator witnessed another streaming smoke and flame before disappearing. The right waist gunner confirmed the 4th. Other crews in the formation provided corroborating testimony. The gun camera footage, though grainy and jumpy, showed Aruṭ's tracers converging on targets with visible impacts. Most damning to the existing doctrine was the ammunition expenditure report. Aruṭ had fired nearly twice the number of rounds recommended for a single engagement. According to gunnery school principles, this was wasteful, undisciplined, and proof that his methods were unsustainable. The conflict moved from debriefing rooms to headquarters offices. On one side stood the operational commanders, men like Colonel Maurice Mo Preston of the 379th Bomb Group, who saw their crews dying daily and were desperate for solutions. On the other side stood the gunnery training establishment, officers who had designed the existing doctrine and had institutional, professional, and personal investment in its correctness. The debate reached its climax at 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe. In a conference room filled with the smell of cigarette smoke and tension, gunnery experts presented their case. Aruṭ's success was a statistical anomaly, a combination of luck and German error. His technique, if adopted widely, would lead to ammunition shortages, burned-out gun barrels, and no improvement in overall effectiveness. Sergeant Aruṭ got lucky, one colonel insisted. If every gunner starts blazing away at 900 yards, we'll run out of ammunition before we run out of Germans. The operational commanders pushed back with equal force. They presented loss statistics. They described watching formations decimated while gunners followed doctrine perfectly and died perfectly. They argued that in combat, results mattered more than theory. Lieutenant Colonel Byrne Lay Jr., a staff officer who would later co-write the screenplay for 12 O'Clock High, reportedly stood during one particularly heated exchange and said, "With all respect, gentlemen, the mathematics of the graveyard don't care about our doctrine. If Sergeant Aruṭ can shoot down 4 fighters using his method, and our average gunner shoots down 0 using yours, perhaps we should be questioning the doctrine rather than the sergeant." The deadlock might have persisted indefinitely, but for the intervention of Major General Frederick L. Anderson, commander of the 8th Bomber Command. Anderson was an unusual figure in the strategic bombing campaign, a West Point graduate who had flown pursuit aircraft in World War I. He understood air combat not as theory, but as visceral experience. More importantly, he recognized that in war, solutions often came from the men doing the fighting, not the men writing the manuals. After listening to both sides, Anderson made his decision. "Test it," he ordered. "Send Sergeant Aruṭ to talk to our other gunners. Let him explain what he's doing. Let's see if it works for anyone besides him." He turned to the senior gunnery instructor in the room. "And while we're testing it, you will not interfere with Aruṭ's technique or recommend any disciplinary action for ammunition expenditure. Is that clear?" It was clear. Anderson went further. He approved the award of the Distinguished Service Cross for Aruṭ's actions over Kassel. The citation, eventually published in January 1945, read, "Staff Sergeant Aruṭ shot down 3 enemy airplanes, and even though the airplane's oxygen line was broken, one gun was jammed, and he was severely wounded, he remained at his post, repaired his gun, resumed fire, and destroyed the 4th plane." The institutional door, if not fully open, was now at least cracked. Chapter 6. The Ripple Effect. Recovered from his wounds by mid-August 1943, Aruṭ returned to combat. This time, however, he was no longer just another tail gunner. Word had spread through the 379th Bomb Group about that crazy Lebanese kid who shot down 4 Germans in one mission. Other gunners approached him between missions, asking questions, seeking insights. Aruṭ, never one for formal instruction, explained his method in simple, practical terms. Don't wait for them to get comfortable. Make them uncomfortable from the moment they see you. The method spread organically, gunner to gunner, crew to crew. As more tail gunners adopted early aggressive engagement, something began to change in the dynamics of bomber defense. Intelligence analysts, initially skeptical, began noticing patterns in after-action reports. Bomber formations whose gunners employed Aruṭ's method showed measurable differences in German fighter behavior. Attack approaches became less determined. Passes were broken off sooner. The psychological effect Aruṭ had hypothesized was proving real. Consider the tactical reality from a German fighter pilot's perspective. Attacking a bomber formation was already a high-risk endeavor. American .50 caliber rounds could shred aircraft structures, and a single well-placed bullet could kill a pilot or destroy vital systems. In late 1942 and early 1943, German pilots had learned the rhythm of American defense. They could approach to within 600 to 800 yards before encountering significant fire. This predictability allowed them to execute textbook attacks. Now, that predictability vanished. Approaching bombers suddenly opened fire at 900, even 1,000 yards. The sky ahead filled with tracers earlier than expected. The psychological effect was profound. Even experienced pilots found their concentration broken. The subconscious calculation, the risk-reward assessment that every combatant makes, shifted. The risk increased, the reward remained the same. Some pilots, particularly newer replacements with less combat experience, began breaking off attacks prematurely. The statistical evidence accumulated. While individual hit probability at extended range remained low, the collective effect of aggressive early fire was reducing bomber losses. Formations that employed these tactics suffered approximately 20 to 30% less casualties to fighter attacks than those adhering strictly to doctrine. By September 1943, even the most resistant gunnery instructors had to acknowledge the data. The 8th Air Force began quietly revising its defensive doctrine. New guidelines authorized gunners to engage at maximum effective range when tactical conditions warrant, bureaucratic language that essentially meant, do what Aruṭ does. The revision represented more than a tactical adjustment. It represented a cultural shift. For the first time, the 8th Air Force was officially acknowledging that combat experience might trump classroom theory. The men doing the fighting were being allowed to redefine how they fought. Chapter 7. The English Channel and Beyond. Aruṭ's war continued through the brutal autumn of 1943. On September 6th, during a mission to Stuttgart, Tondeleau again found itself in desperate combat. German fighters hit the formation hard after the bomb run. Aruṭ, employing his now standard technique, shot down 2 Bf-109s. But Tondeleau suffered catastrophic damage. 2 engines failed. The bomber began losing altitude over the English Channel. Lieutenant Brink made the only possible decision: ditch in the channel. The crew jettisoned everything not bolted down: guns, ammunition, equipment, to lighten the aircraft. Aruṭ reluctantly abandoned his tail position and moved forward as the B-17 descended towards the cold, gray water. Ditching a multi-ton aircraft in open water is one of aviation's most dangerous maneuvers. Tondeleau hit the channel at approximately 120 miles per hour. The impact was violent, shearing off engines, collapsing the nose, and breaking the fuselage. Miraculously, all 10 crew members survived the crash. They scrambled into life rafts as the bomber sank beneath the waves. British air-sea rescue launches reached them within 2 hours. Aruṭ was back flying combat missions within a week. His reputation now extended beyond the 379th Bomb Group. Other gunners requested information about that Aruṭ method. The resistance from Training Command, once formidable, crumbled under the weight of operational evidence. By September 1943, the